An old vampire king paid a poor human woman for an heir, but froze when the baby was born. The valley lay under a thick blanket of fog, and the wind whispered through the twisted trees like it carried secrets. High above the valley, on a jagged cliff, stood an enormous castle, dark and silent, its towers piercing the pale moonlight. No human dared come near it, for the castle belonged to Lord Kale, the vampire king, a ruler of unmatched age and power. Legends told of his cruelty, his strength, and the fact that he had lived for centuries, untouched by time. Yet no story mentioned the one thing that haunted him more than any enemy. He had no heir. Far below the castle, in the human quarter of the city, a small cottage sagged under the weight of poverty. Inside, Alara knelt beside her younger brother, his small frame shivering under a thin blanket. She brushed the dark hair from his forehead and whispered, "Don't worry, little one, I'll find a way." Her hands trembled. Food was scarce. Money was scarce. Hope even scarcer. She had done everything she could to survive, yet her life felt like a never-ending shadow. A knock on the door startled her. Alara opened it to see two men in black cloaks, their faces hidden beneath hoods. One spoke in a smooth, chilling voice. "Are you Alara, daughter of this city?" Yes," she stammered. "We come on behalf of Lord Kale. He has an offer." Her stomach tightened. "Lord Kale, the vampire king," the men nodded, their eyes cold and unreadable. "You are poor," one said bluntly. "Your life is difficult, you have family. Lord Kale will provide what you need if you agree to bear him an heir." Alara froze. "Bear him an heir?" "Yes," the second man said. "It is simple. You will live in his castle. You will carry his child. In return, you will receive gold, land, and protection for your family." Alara's mind spun. It sounded impossible, even terrifying. Yet the offer was more than she could have dreamed. She looked at her brother sleeping quietly and felt a pang in her chest. He needed food, medicine, a life free from fear. Could she do this for him? I need time," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You have 3 days," the first man said. "After that, the offer is gone." When they left, Alara sank onto the floor, staring at the cracked wooden boards beneath her. Could she really go to the castle of the most feared being in all the land? Could she give herself to a creature she barely understood to change her family's fate? Her heart raced at the thought, and a shiver ran down her spine. But she could not ignore the truth. Her family would starve if she did nothing. 3 days later, Alara walked through the castle gates for the first time. The walls were black stone, cold to the touch, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and iron. The guards watched her silently, their eyes sharp, unblinking. She felt like an ant walking into a lion's den. At the center of the great hall, on a raised dais, sat Lord Kale. He was even more imposing than the stories had said. His hair was silver, falling in long waves over his shoulders. His eyes were pale, almost like ice, and yet they held a weight that made Alara's heart skip. He wore black robes, simple but elegant, and his expression was unreadable. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "You are here because you chose to come. Tell me, why?" Alara bowed, trying to steady herself. I want to protect my family. I need this." Her voice was small but steady. Kale studied her silently. His gaze was sharp, piercing through her, making her feel exposed. And then, unexpectedly, his eyes flickered. A shadow of something, surprise perhaps, or curiosity, crossed his face. He looked away quickly, as though he had not meant to show it. "You will live in this castle," Kale said finally. "You will follow the rules. You will not speak to anyone unless spoken to. You will not leave the castle without permission. Do you understand?" Alara nodded. "Yes, my lord. And the child," Kale continued, "will be mine. You will bear the heir and nothing else matters." Alara swallowed. The words felt strange on her tongue. She had imagined this arrangement in her mind 1,000 times, but hearing them said aloud made it real. Life in the castle was unlike anything Alara had known. The halls were vast and empty, echoing with whispers and footsteps that were not her own. Shadows moved where no one should be, and the air was always cold, though the fire in the great hall burned brightly. She was given a small room, simple but clean, and food that was unlike anything she had tasted before. Kale, meanwhile, remained distant. He observed her from the high balcony of his private chambers or from across the great hall, always watching but never speaking. His silence was heavy, pressing on her like the stone walls themselves. Yet she could not deny the moments when his gaze lingered too long, when his expression softened for a fleeting second before returning to ice. The days turned into weeks. Elara learned the routines of the castle, how to move without attracting attention, how to avoid the sharp tongues of the vampire servants who were loyal to Kale alone. She began to see glimpses of the man behind the legend, a loneliness in his long centuries of life, a longing that matched the emptiness she had always carried. Kale, too, began to change. The child growing inside her was not just a symbol of power or legacy. Slowly, unwillingly, he began to care. The first time he entered her room not as a king demanding obedience, but as a man curious and cautious, Elara saw it in his eyes. Something had awakened, something long buried, but the castle was not without danger. One night as a storm raged outside, Kale called her to the great hall. The candles flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. "There are whispers," he said, his voice low. "There are those who would see the king without an heir or who would take the child for their own power. You must be careful. You cannot trust anyone." Elara nodded, fear twisting in her chest. "I will be careful, my lord." Kale's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. "This is not just about survival," he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "This will change everything." Elara felt a shiver run through her. There was something in his voice, something she could not name, that made her heart beat faster. And though she tried to hide it, she was aware of her own curiosity about him, her own fascination with the man behind the mask of fear and power. Days passed and the castle grew quieter. The fog outside thickened, making the towers of the castle look like islands in a sea of silver. Elara walked through the halls, her hand resting on her growing belly. She whispered to herself, imagining the life of the child who would come into this dark, strange world. One evening she sat by the fire in her room, tracing the outline of her belly, when a sudden knock came at her door. Kale entered, silent as a shadow. He stopped at the threshold, looking at her with those pale, icy eyes. "You should rest," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of something, concern, perhaps, or fear. "I am resting," Elara said softly, though she was unsure if she was telling the truth. Kale stepped closer. "The child will change everything," he murmured. I did not expect this." Elara looked at him, puzzled. "Did not expect what?" He hesitated, and for the first time his composure faltered. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes darkened with a shadow she could not read. "To feel," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper, "to feel anything at all." Elara's heart raced. She did not know what to say. The king, the man she feared, the man she had agreed to serve for her family's sake, was vulnerable. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. The fire crackled between them, a small light in the vast darkness of the castle. Outside the storm raged on, but inside a different kind of storm had begun, one of curiosity, tension, and a strange, undeniable connection. Weeks turned into months. Elara learned to navigate the castle, to speak only when spoken to move without drawing attention. Kale continued his silent observation, and yet she could sense his growing fascination, the small moments when he lingered near her, or when he spoke softly to her in a voice meant for no one else. And though fear never left her entirely, Elara began to feel something she had not felt in a long time: hope. Perhaps, she thought, even in this dark, cold place, life could change. Perhaps even the heart of a vampire king could be stirred. But as the first signs of the child's presence became undeniable, Kale froze one night. staring at her with an expression that was almost human. And for the first time, Alara realized that this child, this small spark of life, had the power to change even the oldest, most powerful creature in the world. The castle, once silent and lifeless, now seemed to hum with anticipation. And both king and servant knew in the deepest part of themselves that nothing would ever be the same again. The next night, as the moon rose high and silver light flooded the castle walls, Kale whispered to himself, words no one else would hear. "This cannot be." And in that moment, Alara understood their lives, their fates, were intertwined in a way neither of them could have imagined. The castle had grown quieter since Alara's arrival. The wind still whispered through the towers, but the great halls now seemed alive with a strange tension. Shadows moved across the stone walls as if they were watching, and the flicker of torchlight created dancing patterns that made the air seem almost magical. Alara walked through the halls carefully, her hand resting on her slowly growing belly. Each day, she could feel the life inside her, a tiny heartbeat that was both human and something more. She wondered what kind of child it would be, born of a vampire king and a human mother. Life in the castle was not easy. The servants spoke only in whispers, and even when they nodded politely, their eyes were sharp and judgmental. Alara had to learn quickly how to live in a world where one wrong word, one wrong move, could draw the king's displeasure. And Kale himself was unpredictable. Some days he appeared in the great hall, silent and distant, watching her without speaking. Other days he would vanish for hours, leaving her alone with the shadows and the strange silence of the castle. But the more time passed, the more Alara noticed small changes. Sometimes when she entered a room, she would see him at the far end, his pale eyes following her movements. And though he always turned away quickly when she met his gaze, there was a weight in the air, a tension she could not explain. Alara tried to focus on the child growing inside her. She spent hours in her small room, drawing water from the fountain, resting on the bed, and talking softly to the baby. "You are safe," she whispered one night. "I promise no harm will come to you." The castle was cold and strange, but in her small room with the child she carried, Alara felt a warmth that she had never known before. One evening, Kale appeared at her door. He did not knock. He simply stepped inside, his black robes flowing behind him. His presence filled the small room, and Alara felt a shiver run through her. "You should rest," he said, his voice low and calm, almost gentle. "I am resting," Alara said softly, though she was not entirely at rest. She had been feeling uneasy all day, a strange energy in the air that she could not explain. Kale moved closer, his eyes fixed on her belly. For the first time he seemed uncertain, almost human. "The child, it is different from what I expected," he said quietly, his voice betraying a flicker of emotion. Alara looked at him, puzzled. "Different? How?" He hesitated. I thought the child would be more like me, stronger, cold, unchanging." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "But you, it is warm, human, fragile." Alara felt her heart beat faster. The king, whom she had feared, was speaking with honesty, almost vulnerability. "Fragile does not mean weak," she said gently. "Life itself is strong. Even the smallest spark can burn bright." Kale studied her, and for a long moment they simply stood there silent. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting long shadows across the room. And for the first time, Kale allowed himself to feel a connection that he had not felt in centuries. Days passed, and the castle seemed to shift around them. Kale's presence became less intimidating in small ways. He would speak to her occasionally, not as a king commanding obedience, but as a man observing life. He asked questions about the city, about her past, about the simple joys and fears of human life. And though he was careful not to reveal too much of himself, there were moments when his guard slipped, and Alara saw the loneliness and regret that had accumulated over centuries. Alara, in turn, began to see Kale differently. He was not just a powerful vampire, a ruler of shadows and fear. He was a man who had lived for centuries, carrying knowledge and experience beyond imagination, yet he was also capable of awe, curiosity, and even care. She felt drawn to him, though she tried to hide it. She reminded herself constantly that he was a king, a creature of immense power, and she was just a human woman who had agreed to bear his heir. Yet in the quiet moments when they were alone, she could not deny the pull between them. The castle seemed to notice it too, the way shadows lengthened, the way the air seemed charged with a strange energy whenever they were near each other. One night, as a storm raged outside, Kale called her to the balcony. Lightning flashed, illuminating the towers and the fog-covered valley below. The wind whipped through her hair, and she clutched her belly, feeling the child move as if it were responding to the storm itself. "You feel it, don't you?" Kale said quietly, his eyes on the dark horizon. "The world's shifting, the old rules are ending." Alara nodded. "I feel it, something is coming, something new." Kale turned to her, his expression unreadable. "This child, it is not just an heir. It is a spark, a change, and he hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I do not know if I am ready for what comes next." Alara looked at him, understanding. "Change is never easy," she said softly, "but it is necessary. Life grows in unexpected ways, Kale. Even in the coldest places, life finds warmth." For a moment the storm outside seemed to pause, the thunder holding its breath. Kale's eyes softened, and for the first time, Alara saw the man behind the legend. She realized that he was not just a ruler seeking power. He was someone who had lived too long without hope, someone who had forgotten what it meant to feel. And now, this child, this tiny life inside her, was awakening something he could not control. The days grew longer. Alara's belly grew rounder, and the castle began to feel less like a prison and more like a place of anticipation. Kale's guards whispered among themselves, watching the king's fascination with Alara and the child. Some were wary, fearing weakness. Others were curious, sensing that something monumental was unfolding. Alara spent her days preparing, learning to move through the halls with quiet confidence. She spoke softly to the baby, telling it stories of the city, of the forests, of the people who loved her. She imagined the child growing up strong and kind, a bridge between two worlds. Kale, meanwhile, found himself drawn to her in ways he did not understand. He would visit her room late at night, silently observing, asking questions about the child's development, offering advice on care, and sometimes just sitting in silence. The castle, so long filled with fear and shadow, now felt alive with possibility. Yet danger always lingered. Kale's rival, Lord Malric, watched from the shadows, waiting for a chance to strike. He envied Kale's power and feared the child, sensing that the heir could change everything. Malric whispered to his followers, sowing doubt and tension. The castle's walls, strong as they were, could not completely hold back the currents of ambition and envy. One night, Kale called Alara to the great hall. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the stone floor. "Malric is restless," Kale said, his voice low. "He senses the child. He will act if given a chance. You must be careful. No one can know the full truth of the child's nature. Not yet." Alara nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I will be careful," she said. Kale's eyes softened, and for the first time he reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder. He did not touch her, but the gesture was enough to send warmth through her. He began, then stopped. Words were difficult for him, even after centuries. "I will protect you both. No one will harm you." Alara felt a mixture of fear and gratitude. The man who had once seemed untouchable, distant, and cold was now showing a depth of feeling she had not imagined. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he would keep his word. And yet the shadows of the castle and the storm of politics and power outside reminded her that danger was never far. Weeks passed, and the child grew stronger. Ilara could feel its presence constantly, a heartbeat that resonated with hers, a life that was both human and extraordinary. Kale watched, often in silence, his fascination growing. He would stand at the edge of the hallways, watching her move through the castle, his expression unreadable yet intense. Ilara sometimes caught him staring, and in those moments she saw not a king, not a vampire, but a man who was discovering a feeling he had long forgotten: awe, wonder, and perhaps even something like love. She felt drawn to him too, though she tried to hide it. She reminded herself constantly of the bargain they had made, of the distance that should exist between them. Yet the castle seemed to conspire against her resolve. Shadows moved closer when Kale was near. The wind whispered their names. And in quiet moments when they were alone, the air between them seemed charged, electric, full of unspoken emotions neither dared to voice. One night, as the moon shone bright and silver over the castle towers, Kale approached her room once more. He looked at her belly, now full with life, and his eyes widened slightly. "The child," he whispered, "it is more human than I imagined." Ilara smiled softly. "Life is like that. It surprises us, even in the darkest places." Kale's lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time he seemed unsure of himself. I do not know if I am ready," he admitted, voice low, "but I cannot ignore this. This child, it has changed me." Ilara's heart beat faster. The king, the man she feared, was speaking honestly, vulnerably. She realized that the child inside her had done more than grow. It had begun to awaken the long-buried emotions of a centuries-old ruler. And as the wind howled outside and the shadows danced across the castle walls, both king and mother-to-be knew that their lives had shifted. Nothing would ever be the same again. The night ended with a whisper from Kale, barely audible. "The child, it is the beginning of everything." And in that moment, Ilara understood. The journey they had begun together was far from over. The child growing inside her was more than an heir. It was a spark of life that would challenge, transform, and bind them all. The castle felt different now. The long corridors, once cold and silent, seemed alive with whispers of anticipation. The air itself carried tension, charged with something neither Ilara nor Kale could ignore. The child inside her moved more often now, tiny hands pressing against her belly, and with each movement, a strange warmth spread through the great stone halls. It was as if the baby itself was awakening the castle, stirring it from its centuries-long slumber. Kale walked through the corridors silently, as he always did, but now there was a change in him. His pale eyes, once like frozen ice, held a spark of curiosity and unease. He watched Ilara from a distance, sometimes standing in shadowed doorways, as if he were afraid that any closer approach might shatter the fragile world they were building. There was a tension in him that had not been there before, a mixture of awe, fear, and longing that he did not fully understand. Ilara felt it too. She had grown used to the castle, to the quiet watches of the servants, and to the presence of Kale, which was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Yet now, as her body grew heavier with the child, she sensed something deeper stirring in the king. It was more than fascination. It was as if the very essence of the child had begun to touch the deepest corners of his heart, places he had long since sealed away with centuries of control and solitude. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the sky with shades of blood and gold, Kale appeared at her door. His presence was sudden, silent, and commanding, yet there was an unusual hesitation in his step. Ilara looked up from the small table where she had been arranging herbs for comfort and smiled softly. "My lord," she said, careful to keep her voice steady, "you did not need to come." "I wish to see you," Kale replied, his voice low and even but with a strange vulnerability that caught her off guard. "How are you feeling?" Ilara hesitated, then placed a hand on her belly. "The child moves more now. Sometimes it is gentle, sometimes strong. I think it knows you are near." Kale's gaze flicked down to her belly, his lips parting slightly. For a long moment he did not speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "It is alive in a way I did not expect. I did not expect to feel this." Alara's heart raced. The king, so feared and distant, was speaking with honesty. His words trembled with something he could not name, and for the first time she felt that perhaps the cold and untouchable ruler was capable of emotion, of care, and perhaps even of love. The days that followed were filled with subtle shifts in the castle. Kale's presence was less rigid. He lingered at the edges of rooms, observing Alara as she moved about her daily tasks. He asked questions quietly, gently about the child, about the changes in her body, and about her needs. Though he spoke rarely, every word carried weight, every glance seemed deliberate. Alara noticed the change in herself as well. She felt less fear and more curiosity about the king. She found herself watching him, wondering what thoughts ran behind those pale eyes, what memories and emotions hid behind the mask of centuries. A strange bond was forming between them, quiet but undeniable, a connection that neither dared to name aloud. But the castle, for all its silent grandeur, was never truly safe. Kale's rival, Lord Malric, continued to plot. His spies moved through the city and the surrounding lands, seeking any sign of weakness. Malric despised Kale's fascination with the human woman and the child growing inside her, sensing that it threatened the balance of power in the vampire realm. Every whisper carried danger and every shadow could conceal a threat. One night, as the wind howled and rain battered the castle windows, Kale approached Alara again. She was sitting by the fire, tracing patterns in the ashes with her fingers, lost in thought. "You should rest," he said, standing silently in the doorway. His tone was gentle, almost hesitant, and she noticed a faint tremor in his hands, a sign of emotion he rarely displayed. "I am resting," Alara said softly, looking up at him. "I think the child knows you are near. It moves when you are here." Kale stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her belly. I did not expect this," he said quietly. I thought the child would be like me, strong, cold, unchanging, but it is human, alive, fragile. And yet," he faltered, struggling to find the words, "and yet it awakened something in me I thought was long dead." Alara felt her pulse quicken. The king was speaking honestly, vulnerably, and she realized that the child was doing more than growing inside her. It was changing Kale, stirring emotions he had not felt in centuries. As the pregnancy progressed, Alara faced her own challenges. Her body grew heavier, her steps slower, and the nights were long and restless. Yet she found strength in the castle, in the quiet moments by the fire, in the gentle presence of Kale, who continued to watch over her from a distance. Kale's fascination deepened. He would often stand silently at the edge of her room, observing her as she moved about, speaking softly to the child, preparing meals, or arranging her small space. The shadows of the castle seemed to shift in his presence, acknowledging the change that had begun within him. The king, who had once been untouchable and unfeeling, was now drawn to the human woman in ways he could not comprehend. Yet with this change came fear. Kale understood that the child, though small and fragile, was powerful in ways no one could foresee. The child represented hope, change, and the potential to alter the course of the vampire realm itself. And with such potential came danger. Lord Malric's plots grew bolder, his spies more daring, and the tension within the castle walls became almost unbearable. One afternoon, Alara felt the first true pangs of fear. A servant whispered urgently that a group of strangers had been seen near the outer walls of the castle, moving under the cover of fog and darkness. Kale, who had always been prepared for any threat, moved with a swiftness that startled even the guards. "We must be cautious," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "The child must be protected at all costs." Alara nodded, feeling a strange mixture of fear and reassurance. She realized that Kale's care was no longer distant or formal. It was deeply personal. He was no longer simply the ruler of a vampire realm. He was a protector, bound by something stronger than duty or law. That night, as the storm raged outside, Kale stood at the edge of her room once more. "The child, it has awakened something in me," he admitted, his eyes dark and intense. "Something I thought I had lost centuries ago. I cannot ignore it, and I will not." Alara's heart raced. The king, feared by all, was confessing vulnerability to her. It was terrifying, yet somehow comforting. She realized that the bond between them was no longer one of fear or obligation. It was something far deeper, something that neither could fully understand or control. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparations. Alara learned more about the castle, the people within it, and the world she was about to bring a child into. She spoke often to the baby, telling it stories of the city, the forests, and the mountains. She imagined the life it would have, bridging two worlds, human and vampire. Kale, too, continued his quiet transformation. He spent hours observing, learning, and even speaking softly to the child in ways he could not explain. The castle itself seemed to respond, shadows lengthening and moving as if alive, the air charged with a strange energy that was both beautiful and dangerous. And yet, danger always lurked. One evening, a whisper reached Kale that Malric had discovered a way to infiltrate the castle. The threat was real, and the stakes had never been higher. The child was growing stronger every day, and the king's fascination had become a fierce protectiveness that he had never felt before. As the moon rose high and silver light flooded the castle towers, Kale found himself standing in the hall, staring at Alara's room. He could hear her soft humming, the gentle rhythm of her voice as she spoke to the child. His heart, long frozen by centuries of power and solitude, felt something unfamiliar, a warmth, a longing, a need to protect. He whispered to himself, words he never imagined he would speak. "The child, it is the beginning of everything." Alara, unaware of his presence, continued her quiet preparations. She felt the child move strongly now, as if responding to something she could not see. She smiled softly, placing her hand over her belly. "You are safe," she whispered. "I promise, nothing will harm you." Kale's shadow fell over the doorway, and for a moment the two of them stood apart, connected by the life growing between them. The storm outside roared, lightning flashing across the towers, but inside the castle a different storm had begun. One of emotion, connection, and the promise of a future neither could yet imagine. And as the night deepened, both king and mother-to-be knew that the true test was yet to come. The child would awaken powers, stir emotions, and challenge everything they had ever known. But in that quiet, electric moment, one thing was certain. Their lives, their hearts, and their world had been forever changed. The castle lay quiet beneath a silver moon, but inside, tension crackled like fire. Alara's labor had begun in the dead of night. The air was thick with anticipation, and a strange energy that seemed to hum through the stone walls. Kale paced near the edge of the room, his long shadow stretching across the floor, eyes fixed on Alara with an intensity she had never seen before. "You must focus on breathing," Kale said softly, kneeling beside her. "Do not fight it. Let the child guide you." Alara nodded, gripping his hand tightly. The pain surged through her, sharp and relentless, but in Kale's presence she felt a strange calm. He was no longer distant, no longer the untouchable vampire king. He was human in this moment, fierce and protective, his pale eyes filled with a raw emotion she could not name. The servants moved silently around them, preparing the room, ensuring that no harm would come. The castle, for centuries a place of shadow and fear, seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind outside had stilled, as if the world itself waited for the birth of this child, a life that was both human and extraordinary. Hours passed, the night stretching endlessly. Alara groaned, sweat running down her forehead, and Kale never left her side. He whispered words of encouragement, his hand never leaving hers, and every glance he gave her carried a weight of love, awe, and protectiveness that made her heart ache. "You are strong," he murmured. "Stronger than anyone I have known." Elara managed a weak smile. "I could not do this without you." Cale's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darkening with emotion. "I have never felt like this before. I thought I understood power, control, life, death, but this is different." The room seemed to pulse with energy as the final moments of labor approached. Elara felt the child moving, tiny hands pressing against her from the inside. She cried out, and Cale's face paled at the sound, his instincts as protector and king fully awakened. "Push," he instructed, his voice steady, commanding yet filled with care. "You are almost there. The child is ready." And then, as dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in gold and rose, the cries of a newborn filled the room. Elara gasped, tears streaming down her face, and Cale froze, staring in disbelief. The baby lay in her arms, tiny, warm, and human. For centuries he had expected a child like himself, strong, cold, immortal. Yet here was life, fragile yet full of promise, beating with warmth and humanity. Cale could not move. He had never seen anything like it. His lips parted, and a sound that was almost a gasp escaped him. The child's eyes opened briefly, reflecting the pale light of the room, and Cale felt a pull deep in his chest. A bond stronger than any he had known, stronger than centuries of power, stronger than fear itself. Elara looked up at him, her face glowing with relief and awe. "Cale, it's alive. Our child is alive." Cale's hand shook as he reached out, barely brushing the baby's tiny hand. His pale eyes softened in a way that no one had ever seen, and he whispered almost to himself, "Alive and human, so small, so perfect." The days that followed were filled with wonder and adjustment. The child, whom they named Lucian, grew quickly, displaying a strange vitality that seemed to echo both his human and vampire heritage. He smiled and cooed, his tiny hands grasping at the world with curiosity and strength. Cale watched him constantly, fascinated, protective, and deeply changed. Elara, too, felt a shift within herself. She had entered the castle as a servant of necessity, a human bargaining for her family's safety. But now, as she held her child and looked at the king who had once been distant and cold, she understood the power of connection, of love, and of life itself. She had brought change not only to her own fate, but to the heart of a being who had walked the world for centuries without hope. Cale, for his part, struggled to comprehend his own feelings. Centuries of isolation and control had taught him power, fear, and detachment, yet Lucian had awakened something entirely new. He felt awe, tenderness, and an overwhelming desire to protect. And when he looked at Elara, he realized that he also felt something far more human: trust, affection, and perhaps even love. But the castle, as always, was not free from danger. Lord Malric had discovered the birth and began plotting immediately. His envy and fear of the child's potential power drove him to plan an attack that could shatter the fragile peace. Cale knew that he had to act. The safety of his child and of Elara was now the most important thing in his long life. Cale summoned his most loyal warriors, shadowed figures who had served him for centuries. "No one will harm them," he declared. "Not the child, not the mother. Anyone who dares will face my wrath." Elara watched him, understanding for the first time the depth of his devotion. The king, whom she had once feared, now fought not for power or pride, but for life, for love, and for family. The confrontation came swiftly. Malric's forces, moving under cover of night, approached the castle. Cale's warriors intercepted them, shadows clashing against shadows in a storm of motion and energy. Lightning flashed across the towers, illuminating Cale as he stood at the battlements, his eyes glowing faintly with an inner light. Elara clutched Lucian, watching the scene unfold. She could feel the power of Cale and his warriors resonating through the castle walls. Though frightened, she felt awe. The child had not yet spoken a word, but even Lucian's presence seemed to strengthen the castle's defenses, a symbol of hope and change. Kael's rage and protectiveness were unstoppable. Malric's forces were driven back, retreating into the night, and Kael's eyes blazed with a force that spoke of centuries of power and centuries of love now awakened. After the danger had passed, Kael returned to the room where Alara and Lucian waited. He knelt before them, and for the first time he allowed himself to be fully vulnerable. "You are safe," he said softly, placing a hand on Lucian's small head. "I will protect you, always." Alara's eyes filled with tears. "Kael, you have changed. You care more than I ever imagined." He looked at her, his expression honest and unguarded. "This child, you have awakened something I thought was lost forever. I feel life, hope, and love, and I cannot imagine a world without you both." The castle, silent and shadowed for centuries, seemed to exhale. Light filled the hallways. Shadows softened. And for the first time the ancient walls felt alive, warmed by the presence of life and love. Days passed and Lucian grew stronger. Kael and Alara formed a delicate balance, navigating the challenges of raising a child while managing the responsibilities of the vampire realm. Kael's leadership was transformed. He was no longer a distant, feared ruler. He was a father, a protector, and a man capable of deep emotion. Alara, too, found her own strength. She had entered the castle out of necessity, but now she understood her own power, not through wealth or title, but through love, courage, and the ability to shape the future. Together, she and Kael built a life of balance and trust, their bond strengthened by shared responsibility and deep emotion. Yet even as peace settled over the castle, a quiet tension remained. Whispers of old curses and ancient prophecies drifted through the halls, suggesting that Lucian's life, while extraordinary, might also bring new challenges. Kael and Alara were aware that the path ahead was uncertain, that danger might arise again, and that the child they loved so dearly carried within him the potential to change the world in ways they could not yet predict. But in the soft light of dawn, as Kael held Lucian in his arms and Alara stood beside him, they felt hope. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and power beyond imagining, and together they had survived, protected, and begun to build a family in a world of shadows and magic. Kael looked at Alara, his pale eyes glowing with emotion, and whispered, This is what I was missing all along." Alara smiled softly, placing a hand on his. "We have found it together," she said. And as the castle stood tall beneath the rising sun, the first rays of light danced across the towers, painting the stones in gold. Lucian laughed softly, a sound that carried warmth and life, a promise of a new legacy. And somewhere deep within the shadows, ancient powers stirred, whispering that the true journey had only just begun. But for now, in this quiet, magical moment, king, mother, and child were united. The darkness had been met with love, the cold with warmth, and the future, uncertain yet bright, awaited them all.